My boyfriend is a nurse who works a lot of night shift, which means I'm often alone from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Now, being 4'11 and 120 pounds means that I have to be slightly more security conscious than your average Joe. So once I realized that there'd be long stretches of time where I'd be totally home alone at night, I realized that I had to be extra vigilant when it came to home security. We didn't live in the best of neighborhoods, and after one of our neighbors got their apartment broken into while they were home in the middle of the day, the threat became very real and very frightening to us. We beefed up the locks on the front door, and my boyfriend insisted I go down to the range with him so I could learn how to use his handgun. I always made sure the front door was double locked at night, and I always made sure the gun was loaded and ready in the safe under our bed, especially when I was alone. All this is why it seems so inexplicable to me that our safety could have been compromised in any way, and what makes what I'm about to tell you so incredibly scary to me. It was one of those weeks where my husband was working nights, so I was home alone for the evening. I finished my bedtime routine, turned on my electric blanket, then settled into a half hour or so of Nintendo Switch until I felt sleepy enough to drift off. Just like every night, I made sure all the external windows and doors were locked, and I went to sleep with my bedroom door open so I'd be able to hear if anyone tried to break in. At some point, I remember waking up and almost immediately seeing someone walk past our bedroom and into the living room. I figured it's my boyfriend, who was maybe home a few hours earlier than usual, and I roll over to check my phone and see what time it is. 3:36 a.m. I swear I'll never forget those numbers for as long as I live. Usually, after my husband came home from a shift, I'd get up and have some breakfast with him, then he'd go to bed and I'd go about the rest of my morning routine. It was still pretty early when he arrived home that night, and so I figured that I'd just drift off back to sleep until he came to bed. But as I lay there, I realized that I was listening to nothing but silence. Even if my boyfriend was trying his very best to be quiet, there's no hiding the beeping of a microwave or the sounds of silverware coming out, and he was always hungry when he got back from his shift, so the fact that I couldn't hear him at all just kind of bothered me. So instead of going back to sleep, I got up, put on my bathrobe, and walked into the kitchen to see if he was okay. We had an open-plan kitchen/TV room back then, but as I stepped out of the bedroom, I see no lights coming from the room that I thought my boyfriend was in. I looked over my shoulder, making sure the bathroom is empty, then right when I see that it was dark and deserted, I hear the soft sound of sobbing coming from the dark TV room. As creepy as that sounds, fear wasn't my first emotion. The way I saw it, my boyfriend was crying in the dark room, so all I wanted to do was comfort him. I didn't hesitate to flick the light on, walk in, and ask if he was okay. But when I did, I let out the biggest gasp of my life. Someone, who was definitely not my boyfriend, was sitting on the carpet in the corner of the TV room. They were sitting on their butt, knees up, tucking their face against their thighs so I couldn't see what they looked like, but I could see their body trembling gently from the sobbing. They were half naked, they were filthy, and even in this curled up posture I could see that they were very tall. The run back into my bedroom was a total blur, and I remember this bolt of fear going through me when I initially struggled with locking the door. Once it was secure, I ducked down to the safe, grabbed our gun, and called the cops. I sat on the window ledge of our bedroom, opening up the window as I talked to the dispatcher. My plan was to shoot the guy if he broke into my bedroom, but on the off chance that the bullets didn't stop him, I was going to jump out of the first floor window. There was obviously a huge risk of maybe hurting my ankle or something, but I figured it would at least buy me some time, seeing how I wouldn't last a minute in a straight-up fight with this guy. Being faced with that decision was probably the single most frightening moment of my entire life, but at the same time, it was such a simple one to make. Jump and hurt myself, or hope that he killed me quick. I chose jump. I sat there on the window ledge, pistol aimed at the door, talking to the police dispatcher through my situation for around 15 minutes. She just told me to sit tight because the cops are going to take my door off the hinges before clearing the apartment. Having the property damaged was the least of my concerns at the time, and finally hearing the loud booms of their boots hammering on the door prompted this wave of sweet relief to wash over me. I braced myself to hear a bunch of screaming from the TV room, maybe even shots if the guy charged them with a knife or something. But there was nothing. It was eerily quiet as I put my gun back into the safe, hands trembling the whole time, and it got to the point where I was wondering what in God's name was going on. I put my ear to the door, and all I could hear was the same sobbing sound while the cops tried to talk to the guy in low voices. Eventually, I started hearing the voices getting louder as the cops started escorting the guy out of the room, and as they passed our bedroom while walking down the hall, I distinctly heard the crying man say, "Thank you, thank you." That struck me as kind of sad, but I was just so wired from the fear and adrenaline at the time that I didn't really stop to process it. I just listened as the cops got the guy out of my apartment, their voices getting quieter and quieter until I could no longer hear them. A few minutes went by before I heard the footsteps of one of the cops returning to take a statement from me. I was really shaken up at the time, having gone from half asleep to heart-pounding terror in a matter of seconds, so I kept apologizing to the cop for almost crying every other second. Yet slowly but surely, I managed to give him a clear and coherent statement. And that's when things started to get weird. The first thing was when the cop tried to establish how the man had gotten into our apartment. They themselves could confirm that the front door was locked when they arrived, and there were no other signs of forced entry anywhere in the apartment. So other than a handful of logical explanations, I really had no idea. Either I'd neglected to lock our front door, or the guy had managed to somehow obtain a spare key. And I could categorically confirm to the cop that I'd locked our front door that night, which in turn meant that I was faced with a distinctly creepy possibility that this man had a copy of our front door key. The cop told me that there wasn't much he could do about it there and then, but if it was his apartment, he'd change the locks just to be safe. Before the cops took off, they asked me if I wanted to press charges against the guy. My first instinct was to say yes, but honestly, I also had a strong suspicion that the guy was struggling with some deep-seated mental illness, half naked, crying, thanking the cops who arrested him. He didn't seem like he was living his best life, and I didn't know if I wanted to add a criminal conviction to his extensive list of problems. I asked the cops to keep me updated and let me know if he had a history of break-ins or home invasions, and they assured me that they would, then off they went. Now, a few days later, I get a call from a detective calling himself Mike, who asked if he could stop by the apartment sometime. When he arrived, he told me that there had been some interesting developments in the case. As far as my own personal curiosities were concerned, the man had no history of break-ins or any other crimes for that matter. In fact, he was the one claiming to be a victim. The man told police that he'd been kidnapped and held against his will for weeks, hence why he was so grateful to be found by police. As you can imagine, I was horrified to hear this and protested my innocence to the detective as he tried to reassure me. They didn't believe that this was the case, but logically speaking, the man had to have gotten into my apartment somehow, in which case, they wanted to know how. The detective then asked for a quick tour of my apartment, saying that he was looking for crawl spaces, false walls, faulty locks, and that kind of thing. But then as I watched him, it occurred to me that he could have just easily been looking for a place we might use to keep prisoners. He still hadn't totally ruled us out as suspects, and that creeped me out. But thankfully, the cops didn't move on us and we weren't harassed in any way. Common opinion was that the guy had somehow obtained a copy of our key while suffering a severe mental health crisis, and that the best thing for us to do would be to change the locks. You can bet your bottom dollar that was the first thing me and my boyfriend paid for after he used our city payout to fix our door. But somehow, that didn't quite snuff out all the fear from the incident. I'm not saying that the guy had superpowers and could walk through walls or something, but no copy of our front door key was ever found, either on the guy's person or there at the scene. So in my mind, something else had to have been going on. We don't live in that apartment anymore, so it's not really an issue for us. But all the unanswered questions really bug me sometimes, and it sucks that I'll never know the whole truth. I just came across this subreddit and gosh, some of these are terrifying. I do have a story of something that happened to me from a long while ago, but in hindsight it was really dumb of me and I feel terribly dumb now, so I've always been hesitant to tell. This was a few years ago. It was pretty late, past about 1:30 or 2 a.m. I was living with this boy who was pretty abusive, and he had gotten really jealous at this party that we were at earlier that night. Not even an hour after we had gotten home, he tossed me out onto our front porch and locked the door behind me. I was knocking and pleading for him to please let me back inside. I was still wearing what I had worn to the party and it was freezing out. I wasn't sure what to do. He had my phone, purse, and wallet in the house with him, so I just sat on the porch crying. When he turned off the lights both inside and outside of the house, I knew that he wasn't going to let me back in. I felt so helpless and cold. I thought about knocking on a neighbor's door, though he didn't have many, but I had anxiety about waking any of them up and causing trouble for my boyfriend. So instead, I decided I would try to walk to the gas station and motel, which was like a little less than a mile away, so I could use their phone to try to call a girlfriend of mine to see if I could sleep over with her. Ironically enough, the road I was walking on was Donner Pass Road, so the freezing cold was fitting. But anyway, a little bit into the walk, this tall white pickup truck was approaching on the opposite side of the road that I was on. I tried not to make eye contact for obvious reasons, but then I heard the truck stopping and beginning to make a U-turn, and my heart just started pounding. I just about froze up, but forced myself to speed walk at the very least. The truck pulled up to me, and this guy rolled down his window and asked what I was doing out this late. I told him how I was going to meet my friend at the gas station and that she was expecting me. He sort of smiled and offered me a ride. I said no thank you, citing that I shouldn't hitchhike. He told me, "Well, good. I don't pick up hitchhikers or anyone. You don't look like a hitchhiker, though. You just look like you need some help." He just kept driving next to me and told me that I shouldn't think that he was a creep, and he pulled out what looked like a police badge and told me that he had just gotten off of duty, which is why he was in civilian clothes and out so late. He said he wouldn't mind driving next to me just to make sure I get to where I was heading safely. I was naive and a bit too trusting of his kindness and credentials. When he offered me a ride again, I said that it would be nice because the gas station wasn't that far anyway. He popped the door open for me and I hopped in. The radio was low, it was a little messy, the ashtray was full of cigarettes, and there were a lot of newspapers on the passenger floor, so as I was moving my feet, some of the papers shifted, showing a pair of handcuffs, some coffee cups, empty water bottles, rags, and a highlight-colored bandana and some other things. He apologized, saying it was the truck that he took hunting, but it was super warm, so I was happy and didn't mind at all. He told me his name was John and asked why I was scantily dressed without a jacket, and I started to tell him about the party and the fight that I had with my boyfriend. He was super charming and attentive. He even laughed that he could go back and arrest him. I asked about him and he told me about his family. He was a young dad, he had a wife, a daughter, a son, and a dog, and I told him it was like he had the perfect little family, and he laughed and said he certainly did. Then it had sort of clicked for me to ask him if I could use his phone, but he said no because he had to save his battery. We were approaching the gas station and he drove right past it. I politely said, "Oh, I think that's the one." But he didn't answer me. I suddenly felt sick to my stomach. My heart started pounding. I started getting choked up. My eyes started tearing up as I was looking out the windows and watching the lights behind us get further and further away. It was hard for me to even speak, but somehow I murmured, asking if he could please turn around, and he ignored me. Whenever I would look at him, he just looked empty-eyed and emotionless, totally dead and glazed. I looked back out the window and down at the road to see if maybe we were going slowly enough that I could make a leap out of the car without seriously injuring myself. I remember always hearing, "Never go to the second location," but I thought about the possibility of jumping out and breaking an ankle and how it would be a lot harder to get away with one foot as opposed to two, debating with myself that there was snow on the ground, but then again, snow was hard to get along in, especially when you're not fully clothed. I feel so dumb now too because I wasn't even tied up or anything. I was just so scared though, like there was nothing but trees, an empty road, and us. I was crying pretty badly at this point and asked if I could please borrow his phone again. I don't know why I even asked, and he told me to stop talking. Then he started talking under his breath, saying, "Girls shouldn't be out so late. You shouldn't have been alone this late. Look what you're doing to me. Dressed like a little cutie." And other just creepy, derogatory things. And he kept saying these terrible things too many to type out here, and I wasn't even responding. I was just crying and trying to think past the fear that I was feeling. I remember the pair of handcuffs. I remember seeing under the papers beneath my feet, so I used that little, I don't know how to describe it, like scoopy motion. I managed to use my feet to scoop the handcuffs up and use my heels and toes to push them under the bottom of the seat as far as I could. I was thinking of different things I could do to try to help myself. Like if we were close enough to some upcoming lights or structures, if I ever made it to them, I could just grab the wheel and cause us to crash into them. Or maybe how if I got lucky enough for a cop to pass us, I could grab the wheel and swerve so he would appear to see a drunk driver and we get pulled over. I guiltily thought about the possibility of this man is just having a weird night and how if I did anything it would hurt him. But I told myself that sort of thinking sort of got me into this mess in the first place. He pulled off the road where there was still woods on both sides of us. On his side, the wooded trees were closer to the road. On mine, there was a small gap fully covered in thick, I don't know how many feet of snow, before the trees thickly picked up maybe 10 to 16 yards away. He turned off the car and coldly said that there was something wrong with the car and to get out with him. As he grabbed the keys and was stepping out of the car, I grabbed onto the center console and cried and pleaded not to make me get out with him because it was too cold. He turned around to face me, his door still open, and shouted at me to get out of the car because we had to go check out the trunk bed hatch. I dug my fingernails deeper into the console, thinking my cries of no and head shaking would cause him to come around to my side of the car and drag me out himself. I was crying and said, "Please, John, I'm so cold and scared." I was thinking of everything I'd heard, humanize yourself, use first names. He stared at me in this way I can't even describe to this day. I don't even know how to start. He got back in the car and slinked towards my window, scared he would drag me over the console. He turned off the lights and everything just looked dark blue. He stared at the steering wheel for what felt like years before lighting a cigarette and looking out his window and back at me, then back out his window. He heard me shuffle my feet on the newspapers. I was just adjusting my legs, but while still staring out his window, told me if I thought about running, he'd had a quick way to get where he wanted me. And oddly enough, I was sort of thinking of running minutes before that, but reasoned that if he wanted me out of the car, then I definitely should stay in. Otherwise, he would chase me or shoot me. In case he had his hunting rifle in the back, I didn't dare look. I'm glad I was right. I think at that point I sort of hit some sort of bottom of my reserve, and instead of panic, there was sort of a numbness and exhaustion. There was still an occasional hot tear or two, but I just remember being numb. I talked to a psychiatrist about this sort of thing, and he thinks it just came from my ex-boyfriends giving me PTSD. It was dead quiet, but I finally just barely audibly told him that my friend was still waiting for me and asked about his wife and children. And he flatly said that he didn't have a wife or children and that his house was empty. I asked him what he was thinking about, and he said, "I'm thinking about what to do with you." He didn't say it angrily, he just said it flatly and coldly, which sort of scared me more. I did start getting worked back up to cry, and at that point, he told me not to cry and turned the car on, offering me some heat. I just cried and said I wanted to go home. Eventually, he started driving, and kept driving until we were approaching a gas station. I was gauging the right time to reach for the wheel, but before I could, he started slowing down. While pulling up, he told me not to tell anyone or he would find me. Then he told me all that he was doing was teaching me a lesson to not hitchhike with strangers. He was almost coming to a complete stop when he told me to get out before he changed his mind. Before he could even get another look at me to assess my understanding, I was already down out of the truck and sprinting towards the gas station. The panic was overwhelming me, but then I stopped and remembered to try to see his license plate. I turned around but only caught the blur of the last 3 numbers as he was driving off. I ran inside and asked the clerk behind the counter to please call the police. I waited until the police officer got there, and I'll be honest, I was a little scared that it would end up being John. My fears melted away when the new-faced police officer got there. I gave him the description of John, his appearance, the vehicle color and type, the parts of the license plate number I had caught, the fact that he was an off-duty cop, just basically anything I could. I asked him if I could look at the camera, and the officer disappeared in the back for a little bit, then came back out saying that there was nothing on them. I asked if I would be able to look, and the officer said no, and asked me if I didn't trust him, and I told him of course I did. The officer gave me a ride to my friend's, lecturing me for hitchhiking, consisting of him repeatedly asking if I knew who Ted Bundy was. Of course I knew. I was just naive to think it could never happen to me, and I was just desperate for some warmth. I never heard anything back about the report that was made, so I would try to follow up, and each time I did, they never got back to me aside from this one time I was told my case number didn't exist. But that didn't stop me from trying to follow up. Throughout the months and years, I asked my friend, whose home I slept over that one night, if she had ever heard of any, weirdness or anything since that incident had happened to her or anyone up there, and she always says no. So I sort of let it go and try to tell myself that maybe he actually was just trying to teach me a lesson or something. I mean, I definitely never hitchhiked again, so if it was a lesson, it certainly worked. I never heard anything back having to do with the case. I never heard of any other odd experiences up there. Maybe it was just one man trying to teach me something. But honestly, sometimes I think I tell myself all of that to help me sleep better at night. It all felt very real. Even if it wasn't real, I'm really glad that I didn't get out of that car in the woods that night. This was very recent, 6 days ago to be exact. I'm a huge fan of hiking or just simply taking walks in the woods. The only time I go alone is when I'm in the woods that I live near, and this day I was not. I was with my friend Lars in a walk about 3 hours from my house. We were planning on traveling around and staying at motels in the meantime. That day we decided to take a walk in a popular area for people who like to walk in the woods like me. The catch was that this woods was freaking huge. Not really bad to us though, as we were pretty thrilled about it. There wasn't much. It was pretty, we escaped the crowd, but every now and then we could see someone walking by. We walked for a while until we got to this one spot, not too different from the rest except for one thing. Nobody else was around in the section, and that's why me and Lars took this turn. The other turn had a bit of people. After a while of walking down this path, we spotted a man. A naked man. And we gave each other the look and turned around, and the man was slightly off the path, bent over and looking at something. As me and Lars were walking back, talking about the strange man, I heard a voice behind me. I turned to see the man, who was talking to us about the bug he picked up. I got a good look at him. He was a bit tall, nothing crazy, bald with a few brown hairs beginning to grow, but completely naked. I flashed the man a smile and sped up. We got out of that place as fast as we could, and once we got to the car, we kind of just laughed, and yes, it was creepy, but in a weird way, it was kind of funny. The car ride was nothing, so we'll skip to the motel, and as we were checking in the motel, we see the man walk in. He was a bit hard to recognize considering the fact that now he had clothes on, just torn up clothes though, and he waited behind us in line. And good thing we were almost done checking in because as soon as we did, we went right to our room and locked it with no thought. Now it was definitely getting creepy. Was he following us or was this just some coincidence? We both decided that we weren't going to stay at this hotel for more than a night. Heck, I don't even want to stay one night if it weren't for Lars telling me that it was going to be fine. That night, Lars wanted to go outside for a cigarette. I don't smoke, but no way was I going to stay in this room alone. I followed him outside and we chatted for a bit, and after a few minutes I see the guy walk out the doors. Lars put out his cigarette and began to walk inside, but before we got in, the guy pulled out what was probably a knife or something else sharp. It was dark, I could barely see, and started carving through his sleeve, and right into his arm. I saw liquid trickling to the ground and immediately knew that it was blood. I rushed into the lobby and Lars got the idea and followed, and we alerted the staff, but by the time they got someone to come out, the guy was gone. To this day, I still have so many questions. Did he follow us? Why was he naked? Why was he doing that to himself? I'll probably never know the answer, but I honestly am still spooked, and I don't know what I'll do if I see him again. I just hope I don't have to think about that day. I've been debating about whether or not to post this, but I finally decided that it's been long enough for me to talk about it. This happened to me and my mom a few months ago back in October. It happened in a very rural part of New Hampshire, like a side road on a side road type of neighborhood. It was pouring out, as it had been raining for pretty much the whole day. My mom had gotten back from down the street in my sister's car, and I was on the couch in the living room when suddenly I hear the doorbell ring. Our front door has a big glass pane in the front, so you can look out from the inside and someone can look in from the outside. Through this window pane, I see a man. I didn't get a great look at him as I didn't have my long-distance glasses on. The man noticed that I had seen him and waved as if though he was trying to be friendly. For the rest of this post, I'll just refer to him as Poncho Man. I got up and thought about opening the door for Poncho Man, but relented. As I couldn't properly see who it was, I didn't want to let a stranger into the house. Instead, I went down the hall to my parents' bedroom where my mom was getting ready for work. She asked what was up, and I explained to her that a man in a poncho was outside our door and wanted to talk to us. She went as white as a ghost. Immediately, she stopped getting ready, closed and locked the bedroom door, and started checking the windows to make sure they were locked. I asked her what was going on. My mom explained that as she was driving home, she had seen the Poncho Man. He had been standing, motionless on the side of the main street. As soon as my mom turned down our road, he started to walk, presumably to follow her. She said the encounter was weird, but thought nothing more of it. Why would someone be out in the pouring rain down a back road in the afternoon? It was like he was waiting for something. I started to panic as well. My mom called my aunt, the two are like best friends, and asked what she should do. My aunt told her to call the police immediately, and so we did. We proceeded to pace around the bedroom, frantically looking out the windows to see if we could see Poncho Man. From where the bedroom was angled, it was impossible to look at the front porch and see if he was still there, but we were desperate for anything. After what felt like hours, we finally saw a police car pull up. We carefully unlocked the door and went down to let the officer in, and we explained what we saw, and he agreed to do a scan around the neighborhood. As he left, I noticed that there was something on the doorknob. I took it off, and it was a political ad for a candidate that was running for office. It's possible Poncho Man was just campaigning for the candidate, but there are a lot of holes in that story. It was pouring out, so why would you go door to door? And why would you go that route in such a rural neighborhood? The houses are so far apart you barely make a dent on foot. The time doesn't make sense either. Sure, I and my mom were home, but it was about 4 in the afternoon. Most people would still be at work, so you'd probably get no response from knocking anyway. Eventually, the officer returned, and he had found the guy down the road and had questioned him. Poncho Man was able to ID himself, and he claimed that he was a political campaigner and was just knocking on doors for that reason. When probed further, conveniently enough, Poncho Man couldn't provide any other door signs, as the one he had left on her house was the last one. And that makes the campaign story even more absurd. Our house is in the middle of the street. It's not like we were the last by any means, so why wouldn't you bring enough for the whole street? And even the officer pointed this out to us and said it was unusual behavior. Although the officer was suspicious of him, there wasn't anything he could do about it, as there was no way to prove intent. He told us to be alert and do not hesitate to call if Poncho Man returns. Now fast forward a few weeks, and I start noticing that a police car seems to be permanently stationed down the road from us, about a 3-minute drive. I got curious and asked my mom about it, and she said that there were multiple break-ins into houses down the road, and the police were doing a sort of sting operation. The Poncho Man encounter and the break-ins may be unrelated, but considering how Poncho Man acted, I have a sinking feeling that they're connected. My wife and I recently purchased our first home after the birth of our daughter. Everything was as you would expect the first few months. Painting, decorating, renovating, basking in our newfound slice of the American dream. You get the idea. Unusual things started happening several months ago. One day, as I was getting home after work, I passed by a strange truck 2 or 3 houses down from ours. I say strange for a few reasons. We know literally everyone in our small neighborhood, and I'd never seen this truck or person before. There's no reason for through traffic to come down our street, and the truck was driving very slowly, like put it in drive but not press the gas slowly. As I pulled in the driveway, the truck flipped a U-turn and came back towards my house. Getting out of my car, the truck crawled by and the driver stared daggers at me as he passed, then just sped off. I don't like to judge based on appearances, and I like to think that I don't really scare easy, but something about this guy's eyes gave me a bad feeling. Obviously, this was weird. I mentioned what happened to my wife, telling her that we should be more mindful about security. When I told her the type of truck, my wife said, "That same truck drove by and the guy stared at me when I got home this afternoon. I thought he was just being creepy and checking me out." I tried to tease her a bit to lighten the mood, calling her cocky for assuming any guy driving by was checking her out. I didn't want her to freak out, but I was definitely freaked out. We saw the truck a few more times over the next couple of months, either driving by slowly or parked down the block and facing our yard. But one day the truck stopped driving by and we haven't seen it since. I sort of dismissed the whole thing as me being paranoid. But then other things started happening. In the past month or so, my wife and I have been hearing tapping on the windows at the front of our house at night. It's happened 2 or 3 times to each of us separately, always at about 10 or 11 p.m., and always a soft but distinct tap, 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 tap. It sounds like knocking with a single knuckle on the metal part of a screen door, if that makes sense. The first time that my wife and I heard the tapping together was last weekend. We were in the front room playing with our daughter at around 9:30, just about to settle down for bed. Our front room has a large, almost floor-to-ceiling window running the length of the wall next to the front door, which faces the street. We were all sitting on the floor with our backs to the window reading our daughter a book when we heard it. Tap, 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 tap. Now our house is older. Creaks and cracks are not uncommon, but this sound was so distinctly intentional that my wife and I immediately looked at each other and bolted up out of the room. I had my wife and daughter lock themselves in the back room while I turned on all the lights and did a sweep around the outside of the house. Of course, I didn't see anything and was ready to dismiss the whole thing as more paranoia over something that probably had an innocent explanation. Until last night. At around 9:45, we heard our daughter making noises on the baby monitor. I waited a few minutes to see if she would settle down, but when it became clear that she wouldn't, I got up to put her back to sleep. The layout of the room is important to visualize this next part. This room is on the side of our house, but the exterior wall juts out a bit in an L shape, and the corner of this L is made up of windows. If you're standing in the door to the room, you're directly across from these windows in one corner, and there's a rocking chair in the other corner pointed towards the front of the house. One window faces the street and the other faces our neighbor's house. A garden bed planted with small shrubs wraps around the outside of the house directly underneath. I was sitting in the chair getting my daughter settled down. I had a lamp on so the room was softly lit. When she fell asleep, I stood up to put her in her crib when something caught my eye. There was a figure standing about a foot away from the window, in the bare space between the shrubs and the house, and they were staring at us. I didn't look long enough to see anything more than what appeared to be a man in a light gray hoodie standing a few feet away on the other side of the glass. Sprinting from the room, I brought my daughter back to my wife and I's bedroom, leaving her there while telling my understandably confused wife to lock the door. After turning off all the lights inside the house and turning all the lights outside, I began moving from room to room. Peering out of the windows into the darkness, I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Whoever it must have been had taken off after seeing me notice them and me making a quick exit. Obviously, I had some trouble sleeping after this, I spent hours checking security cameras and going from room to room looking out windows into the night, hoping but also not hoping that I would see anything that could explain what happened. This morning, I went outside to the spot where the figure would have been standing. I thought and hoped that maybe there was a plant or something that I mistook for a person. When I got to the spot, I realized the figure had been standing exactly in a bare patch of ground about 2 feet in diameter, directly in front of that window. Part of me is still hoping that I'm being paranoid. The mind can play tricks on you in the dark, seeing things that aren't there, especially when you're sleep-deprived and a new parent. But with everything that's been happening, I can't shake the feeling that there was actually someone out there last night, watching us. But please, let me be wrong. When I was 6 or 7, I was coming home to Brooklyn from a movie in Manhattan with my friends. I was the only one who lived in BK, so I walked home from the train alone. I was used to being out late by myself. I had a midnight curfew, but I frequently broke it because I thought nothing bad would ever happen to me, despite an uptick of assaults in our neighborhood at the time. This night, however, I was actually slated to get home on time for once. It was the summer after I graduated high school and I was feeling amazing. I'd had a little to drink and a little to smoke and I felt like I was on top of the world. It was so hot out and I remember that I was wearing this long, sheer cape thing with a very tight and revealing little dress underneath. Not that anything would have probably been different if I had been wearing shorts and a t-shirt. However, because of my fun little outfit, I was feeling myself and being so stupid, taking selfies while I walked down the dark streets and listening to music with both headphones in, not paying any attention to my surroundings, and I think I even sang as I walked. I got to my building after finishing my 10-minute walk from the train and walked up to the steps to our apartment. We lived in a brownstone with apartments in it, and ours was on the 3rd floor. We had a gate at the bottom of the steps separating us from the sidewalk. I pulled out my headphones and began to fumble with my keys at the top of the steps. And just as I had found the correct key, still humming to myself and thinking about my great night, I heard the latch on the gate clank as if it were being opened. I turned around and saw a man standing at the gate, staring at me. He was young, probably early 20s, wearing a gray hoodie with the hood up, covering part of his face. But I could see his eyes, and immediately I knew something was off because of how blank yet nervous his expression was. One hand was on the handle of the gate, as if he were about to open it completely, but stopped once I turned around. Somehow, my fight-or-flight instinct didn't kick in yet. It was probably the alcohol. I cautiously called down, "Can I help you?" And he didn't respond. I looked him over more closely and realized then that his other hand, the one not on the gate, was moving, fast and low near his waist. I registered that he was touching himself, gasped, and within milliseconds, he was sprinting up the stairs behind me, reaching out his hand to grab me. My brain clicked into place and I started screaming at the top of my lungs as I jammed my key into the door and slammed it behind me. I ran up the stairs to my apartment screaming for my dad, not even stopping to make sure the door was locked, thinking that if he followed me upstairs, he'd soon be met by my very tall father and our very loud dogs who slept in the bedroom next to our apartment door. As I looked over my shoulder while tearing my way up the stairs, I saw his face pressed up against the glass window, still watching me, but now his eyes were furious. I ran into our apartment, still screaming to my parents to call the police. My dad went upstairs and looked around, but he was gone. The police came anyways after my mom called and came upstairs to take my statement so they could make their report. The 2 cops who showed up asked me to describe him. I did, and they said they'd cruise around for him, and regardless if he was found, a detective would call me soon to make a more detailed report. But they never called me. There were many more assaults that continued to take place in my neighborhood for the rest of summer, and I shudder every time I think about what would have happened if I hadn't taken out my headphones before I began unlocking my door. I don't know how long he was following me for, and as far as I know, he was never caught. From that point on, for those last few weeks before I left for college, I would call my dad and make him meet me at the train station so he could walk me home safely. Now, as an adult, I am far more cautious than when I was a teenager. I am always extra aware of my surroundings, especially at night, and I don't look at my phone while I walk home. I'll never get the image of his blank stare as he lunged towards me out of my head. I will never forget the feeling in the pit of my stomach as I realized that he followed me home, watching me and touching himself, and was now waiting to strike. It was like being a deer realizing it's being stalked by some sort of predator. Because a predator, like a tiger, accidentally stepped on a twig and gave itself away, right before it could pounce on its prey. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. About 2 years ago, a group of my friends went out to a concert. We had a good time, plenty to drink, and the concert had ended and we were outside trying to figure out a place to cure our drunchies. We were standing in a circle on the sidewalk and our friend group consisted of 7 guys and 1 girl. Some random guy comes up and stands way too close to the girl in our group. We didn't know what he was doing and it was very odd. All 7 of us guys just stared at him like, "What are you doing?" He noticed us staring at him and he just silently left. Our friend, Lexi, had a disgusted look on her face and told us he was standing so close that she could feel his boner on her leg. As he gets further up the street, we see him approach another woman who ignores him and keeps going on her way. He then turns around and starts coming back to where we are and walks past us staring at our friend Lexi, and we tell him to keep it moving, you creep. About 2 minutes later, we hear a woman screaming, and our whole group starts spinning towards the screams. He's fully on top of a woman, and there's a guy laying on the ground next to the woman screaming. My friend jumps on his back and gets him in a headlock and starts pulling him off the woman. I was fuming with anger and disgusted and just started punching the guy in the face multiple times when my friend had him in a headlock. At this point, the guy is basically unconscious, so we stop and leave him lying there on the concrete. The guy who was lying on the concrete next to the woman being assaulted then wakes up and comes over and kicks the creeper in the face very hard. Apparently, the creeper came up to this guy and woman and started trying to touch the woman and saying that he wants to do terrible things to her. Well, the guy and the woman were boyfriend and girlfriend, so obviously the guy was livid. But they were out celebrating his birthday and he was super drunk and unable to defend himself. The creeper guy punched him in the face, knocked him out, and had the woman to the ground and began assaulting her, which is when we showed up. I'm just thankful that we were around and showed up quickly, as it could have been so much worse. I normally don't condone violence at all, but sometimes it's the only option. This story took place in early 2017. I had recently moved from a major city to a small town in the Midwest to get myself together and separate myself from bad habits that I had developed. Previously, I'd been living on the West Coast and worked for a couple who were pot farmers, just trimming their weed for one season with a few other trimmers. Nothing major stuck out to me other than the guy in his mid-30s who was a major jerk and super protective of his weed, and his girlfriend was someone I wouldn't normally get along with, but she was alright. I trimmed their weed that season and they paid me a portion up front. He said the rest would come after he sold a few pounds or whatever, because that was just how the business went. They did end up paying me within a few weeks, so all was good with me. However, the man here kept texting me after I moved with random, "Hey, how you doin's?" I never liked the guy, got bad vibes from the get-go, but his wife and girlfriend was a friend of a close friend, so I sort of gave them the benefit of the doubt. Anyway, the wife and girlfriend started messaging me via text nearing spring after I had worked for them trimming weed that fall season, asking if I would be available to house sit for them while they were on vacation out of the country. At this point, I was living in Colorado and the farm was in California. I did not have a permanent job set up yet, and they were offering good money to house sit, plus make some extra money trimming weed that they had left over for the season. Stupidly, I drove my butt 17 hours with dollar signs in my eyes, and all was terrible from there on. I would like to write out something long and detailed and make this like a horror story, but the gist of it is that someone was there at their house the entire time that I was house sitting. I'll try and set up the scenario for as best I can. They have a full house with gardener's quarters attached to their main house. There was one bedroom and a bathroom, an electric stove, kettle, kitchen area in the gardener's bedroom. There was also a doorway from this area into the main house blocked by a bookshelf on my side. When they invited me to stay and house sit, they were there for about 2 or 3 days, and part of their stay included drilling the door shut on the opposite side so that I couldn't enter their house. This didn't bother me, and I honestly understood why they may lock up their house, but things got really freaking weird afterwards. I had been there alone for a few days, just trimming weed, walking the dogs, filling the hummingbird feeders, watching the house like I was supposed to. Honestly, this house was out in the middle of BFE, so I don't even think anyone would have even come out there anyway. The girlfriend/wife would call from Morocco every so often to check up on me. I thought everything was fine, until I started to hear water running from the kitchen inside of the house. The part of the house that I had no access to but was directly connected to. I immediately called the couple, or texted them maybe, and told them that I could hear someone in their house. And their response was literally, "It's none of your concern what you hear on the other side of the wall." You guys, this just turned my stomach. I was in the middle of nowhere, locked by a gate on their property, hired to house sit, and all of a sudden it was not my concern if someone was inside their place. It freaked me out. I still had 2 more weeks to be at this place, and without phone service, I was properly freaked out. Over the next few days, I would feel scared and calm in sort of waves. At one point, I was sitting outside with the dogs, and they all ran up to the side of the house, wagging their tails like they were greeting someone, and I heard a very quiet shush, and footsteps patter off. I continued to hear the TV, microwave, water running from the main part of the house. The language the girlfriend/wife was using with me via text was too personal in regard to what I was doing. I mean, sure, they could have had a camera installed, although I scorched the room for any devices, but the sounds and even the dogs reacting to what I heard was enough for me. Once I realized that I was house sitting but also being spied on in some weird way, I started to have fun with it. I don't know if I figured that I was going to die anyway, or maybe if I acted crazy enough they wouldn't want me for whatever their purposes were. But one night, I was out on the small porch steps having a very late cigarette. It had to be 11 or midnight, and I could hear someone walking around the perimeter of the house. So I stood up, opened the door to the gardener's quarters, and closed the door. As if I had walked back inside, but I just opened the door and closed it to give that impression, keeping my position with my cigarette on the porch. Immediately, someone walked out from the side of the house because they thought I went inside, noticed me, and ran into the woods. In my mind, I set up a tiny trap to see if I was delusional, and it proved that I wasn't. So I started doing crazy, dumb stuff because I was alone. Nothing too wild, just blasted Backstreet Boys, set up their garbage cans like a drum set, and walked around topless. Honestly, I thought that if these people were crazy enough to freaking watch me while I house sat for them, I had to do something more ridiculous to push them away. Maybe that doesn't make sense, but I can't help to reference the Hey Arnold episode where a bully is after him and he says, "Don't hit me, I'll hit me, I'm crazy." Anyway, the couple finally came back to their house from Morocco and acted like they didn't want to pay me. They did after some pulling and tugging, but good God, don't ever go house sit and not really know the people you're house sitting for in the Emerald Triangle, or just don't even go there. It's truly a shady business. Last night at around 5 a.m., I was asleep. I heard a lot of the dogs in the neighborhood, including mine, barking. I tried to ignore them because they do that sometimes. They bark for anything and everything. And a couple of seconds later, I think I hear what sounds like people yelling. At least 2 different people. I'm still half asleep, so at first I'm thinking it's a bunch of teenagers just being rowdy and annoying. I used to do stuff like that. But then I started to understand what they were saying. It sounds more like arguing. I'm starting to wake up and grab my phone and call the police. I'm on the phone with dispatch and hear what sounds like a woman screaming bloody murder. I've never heard anyone scream in such agony. And then I hear a man's voice go, "Oh God, oh God, oh God." and dispatch tells me that the other people have called the police so they're on their way. Sounds like the people are right in my yard. My mom is awake at this point and comes to my room asking if I hear it too. We finally get the courage to look out the window. It's just one woman, and she's standing right under the streetlight near our yard and screaming. At points, she's making her voice deeper and kind of sounds like a man, but it's just her. Her hair is tangled and she's wearing only shorts and a tank top in January. The police pull up 2 minutes later and they try patting her down. Every time they go to pat her down, she grabs her pockets. Eventually, they just arrest her. I know she probably just wasn't all there or high, but it was really scary. I've never seen someone acting like that, and I've never heard someone in such agony. I don't know what was wrong with her or what happened to her after that, but I honestly can't stop thinking about it. It was the spring after I graduated college. I'm a 22-year-old female and didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. So, decided to take a pause and ride my bike down the coast from Canada to Mexico. I was pretty nervous to be going by myself, but for the majority of the time, I felt safe. Halfway through or so, I got pretty comfortable with sleeping alone in fairly empty campsites and parks. There were even some stretches on the trip that I rode with other bike tourists. This one encounter, however, brought my guard back up for the remainder of the time. I was halfway down the Oregon coast and was a mile or so from the campground that I had planned to stay for the night. There was this notable yellow vintage Ferrari car that had passed me headed in the opposite direction. When I pulled into the campground, I stopped at the information board to look at the map and fees. As I'm sitting there, I see the yellow car coming down the road and it stops where I am. This older guy in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, gets out and starts looking at the board with me. He's friendly and seems completely normal, charismatic even. He's asking me about my trip and starts mentioning how he's from the area but has never checked out this campground. At this point, I'm still pretty naive. There's plenty of nice people I've met on the trip that chat me up and ask me about the bike tour. He's talking to me and getting closer, and this part is what starts to make me uneasy. He would repeatedly reach out his hand and shake mine like he was about to leave, but every time he shook my hand, he would grab my forearm with his other hand and do this weird gasp laugh thing. The way he did it looked insane, and the arm grasp was very firm. It sent shivers down my spine. Then he dives into another topic and repeats this freaky handshake maybe 2 times more in between. I realize that I'm completely out of sight from anyone in the campground. I have no phone service, and I'm now very close to him and in his open car door. There's a knot in my stomach. I'm on the verge of tears, and my voice is shaking with every response. At the time, I didn't even know why, but something felt very off about him. I finally speak up loud, hoping someone can hear me and tell him that I got to get going, run to my bike, and speed to the campground. When I get there, I don't even try to find the hike and bike spots and just throw my tent down directly across from the camp host. Again, I had a lot of encounters with random strangers at this point, but none of them terrified me like this one did. I fought with the idea that he was probably just an overly friendly guy, but the fact that he would repeatedly grab my arm and laugh was just frightening. All in all, most people I met were very sweet and it made me very trusting of others. Even if he was harmless, his actions were a good reminder that I had to be mindful of my vulnerable situation and be much more alert. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and super fun live streams on Sunday, Tuesdays, and Thursday nights. You should come join. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, necesito usar el baño de cachorros.